China, first row. China, 67%. That's tariffs charged to the USA, including currency manipulation and trade barriers. So 67%, I think you can, for the most part, see it. Those with good eyes, with bad eyes. We didn't want to bring, it's very windy out here, we didn't want to bring out the big chart. So it's 67%, so we're going to be charging a discounted reciprocal tariff of 34%. I think, in other words, they charge us, we charge them less. So how can anybody be upset?
Trade war, tariff war have no winners. China does not want to fight, but will not fear when they come our way. Let me stress, if the US truly wants to address the issue through dialogue and a negotiation, it should stop exerting maximum pressure. China never accepts that.
China is the most imbalanced economy in the history of the modern world, and they are the biggest source of the U.S. trade problems. And indeed, they are problems for the rest of the world.
The U.S.-China trade war escalated as China unveiled retaliatory tariffs of 125% on imports of U.S. goods, matching the level imposed by U.S. President Donald Trump on Chinese imports. China's increased tariffs on U.S. goods, rising from 84% to 125%, will take effect on April 12th. The hike comes after the White House kept the pressure on the world's #2 economy and second biggest provider of U.S. imports by singling it out for an additional tariff increase, having paused most of the reciprocal duties imposed on dozens of other countries. Trump announced a 90-day tariff pause on dozens of countries after his rapid-fire duties rocked financial markets, but ratcheted tariffs on Chinese imports, raising them to an effective rate of 145%. The trade spat with the United States comes as Chinese policymakers have struggled to revitalize the economy after the COVID-19 slump, as domestic demand remains sluggish due to weak confidence in the face of a years-long property market crisis and renewed deflationary pressure. U.S.-China trade war timeline. The China-U.S. trade war began in 2018 with initial tariffs, escalating through 2020 with a Phase 1 deal offering temporary relief. In 2025, under Trump's second term, tariffs surged. February 2025, the U.S. increased tariffs by 10%, and China retaliated with 15% on U.S. coal and LNG. March 2025, U.S. added another 10%, reaching 20%, with China imposing up to 15% on U.S. farm goods. April 2nd, Trump raised the tariffs on China by another 34% after accusing China of tariff and non-tariff trade barriers of 67% as part of his reciprocal tariffs policy expressed during his Liberation Day speech. The White House confirmed tariffs would stack on top of previous impositions, resulting in an effective tariff rate of 54% on all Chinese imports to the U.S. beginning in 1 week. April 4th, China announced that it would impose additional tariffs of 34% on all U.S. goods effective April 10th. April 7th, Trump threatened to impose an additional 50% tariff on Chinese goods on April 9th if China did not withdraw its retaliatory measure of a 34% tariff on all U.S. goods by April 8th. This would boost the effective 54% tariffs on China on April 9th to 104%. April 9th, China responded with retaliatory tariffs of 84% on U.S. goods. In response, Trump increased tariffs on Chinese goods to 125% on the same day. However, the White House clarified the next day that the tariff rate had risen to 145%. April 11th, China, in retaliation, announced a renewed increase of tariffs on all American imports, raising them to 125%. Economic impact on the U.S. consumer costs. Higher tariffs have increased prices for American consumers on imported goods, such as electronics, textiles, and agricultural products. Industry effects. Sectors reliant on Chinese imports, such as manufacturing and retail, face higher costs and potential job losses. Economic impact on China. GDP growth. The trade war has reduced China's economic growth. Global implications of the U.S.-China trade war. Supply chain disruptions. The trade war has disrupted global supply chains as both countries are integral to international trade. Inflation. Higher tariffs have contributed to global inflation, particularly for goods like electronics and commodities. Here are the big options Trump and Xi might consider based on current dynamics and potential outcomes. Double down on tariffs. Both could further increase tariffs or expand their scope to include more goods or services. Negotiate a deal. Both can pivot to talks, aiming for a new trade agreement similar to the 2020 Phase 1 deal. This might involve China increasing U.S. imports or addressing intellectual property concerns in exchange for tariff reductions. Trump has hinted at openness to deals, claiming China wants to negotiate. Success here could stabilize markets and ease inflation, but requires both sides to compromise, a tall order given current tensions. Pause or roll back tariffs. Facing market turmoil and recession fears, both could temporarily freeze or lower tariffs. Partial relief could mitigate price hikes, but won't undo the broader economic damage already in motion. Rally allies for a coalition. Trump could push for a multilateral approach, convincing allies like the EU, Japan, or Canada to align with U.S. tariffs or sanctions against N.
China is the most imbalanced economy in the history of the modern world, and they are the biggest source of the U.S. trade problems. And indeed, they are problems for the rest of the world, because what we've seen is that as the U.S. announced the tariff wall last week, many of those goods have already started flooding into Europe.
So as you see it now, this trade war is China versus the rest of the world?
Well, I'm not calling it a trade war, but I'm saying that China has escalated, and President Trump responded very courageously to that, and we are going to work on a solution with our trading partners.
China has made clear multiple times its severe position on tariffs. Trade war, tariff war have no winners. China does not want to fight, but will not fear when they come our way. Let me stress, if the U.S. truly wants to address the issue through dialogue and a negotiation, it should stop exerting maximum pressure. China never accepts that. Any dialogue must be based on equality, respect, and mutual benefit. If the U.S. is determined to fight a tariff war or trade war, China's response will continue to the end. China is a responsible country. Our countermeasures against the U.S. bullying acts are to safeguard our legitimate rights and interests, and to safeguard the international rules and order, the common interests of countries around the world, and international fairness and justice. In face of U.S. hegemonism and bullying, concessions and backing down will lead nowhere.